In 2007, Irish wildlife officials loaded Norwegian eagle chicks into transport crates and flew them to Killarney National Park. Over the next 18 years, they released 245 of them onto a coastline that had not seen a white-tailed eagle since 1912. The program had a plan, controlled release sites, monitored territories, defined success metrics. By August 2025, satellite data from those 245 birds confirmed the program had worked. It had also confirmed something the program never anticipated. The eagles were not staying where they were put. They were building nests in counties the program never targeted. A pair bred in Northern Ireland in 2024, the first in 150 years, despite no bird ever being released there. They were crossing international boundaries. They were reorganizing food webs that had run without an apex predator since before the First World War. And they were doing it with no human instruction, no management, and no model that scientists had prepared for. This video follows 18 years of monitoring data sourced directly from Ireland's national parks and wildlife service and Norway's Institute for Nature Research, the two institutions that tracked every satellite-tagged bird through breeding failures, illegal poisonings, and the storms that destroyed active nests mid-season. Every claim here is traceable to peer-reviewed records. This is not a conservation success story. It is a data-backed account of what happens when an apex predator stops cooperating with the humans who brought it back. Most coverage of this project shows the release footage and declares victory. This one follows the data to where it gets uncomfortable, to the discovery that what Ireland released was not a bird. It was a biological function that had been missing for a century. And what that function is doing to the Irish coast right now, researchers admit, they still cannot fully explain. But before you can understand what the tracking records are showing, you need to understand what Ireland destroyed, and why it took nearly 100 years for anyone to admit what that destruction actually cost. The white-tailed eagle did not disappear from Ireland. It was removed, deliberately, systematically, and with the full cooperation of the landing class that saw it not as an apex predator, but as a liability. By the late 19th century, landlords across Ireland and Britain had classified the white-tailed eagle as vermin. Gamekeepers were paid per carcass. Poison bait, strychnine-laced meat left on cliff edges and shorelines was not occasional, it was policy. The birds were shot from nest sites that had been used for generations. Their eggs were collected for private museums. And when the last confirmed breeding pair in Ireland nested in County Mayo in 1912, no one recorded it as a loss. It was recorded as a completion. The job was finished. Think about that. A species that had hunted these coasts since before written Irish history was not driven out by ecological collapse. It was poisoned by an administrative decision. And when the eagle disappeared, something left with it that no one measured at the time because no one had the language for it yet. The function of the sky. The coastal food web lost its processor, dead fish accumulated, carrion went unrecycled, waterbird populations drifted without regulation. Ireland's coastline kept running the way a clock keeps running after you remove one gear, slower, unevenly, and nobody noticed because they had forgotten what the rhythm was supposed to sound like. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew about our natural world, hit subscribe. We go deep on stories like this, the ones that challenge the official narrative with actual evidence. Now back to the 18-year gamble to bring them back, because the science of what came next was as precise and as fragile as anything Ireland's wildlife agencies had ever attempted. Now here is what you need to understand about how Ireland brought them back, because this was not a simple release program. It was an act of biological precision executed across 2 countries, 2 decades, and 2 phases of intervention that required a level of coordination most governments cannot manage for human infrastructure, let alone wildlife. Phase 1 began in 2007. Researchers from Norway's Institute for Nature Research identified active white-tailed eagle nests in areas where chick survival rates were high enough to sustain extraction without damaging the donor population. They removed young birds, old enough to survive transport, young enough to imprint on Irish landscape rather than Norwegian. Those chicks were then flown to Killarney National Park, held in acclimatization enclosures, and released into a country their species had not touched in nearly a century. The first phase ran until 2011, 100 birds. That was the original target. And then 2012 happened. Exactly 100 years after the last confirmed breeding pair nested in County Mayo, the first wild-born white-tailed eagle chicks in Ireland arrived in 2012. Not released, born. The symmetry was, by every measurable account, theatrical, but every detail of it was verified by NPWS monitoring records. 1 century of absence, closed in a single breeding season. If you made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't look away from the facts. Subscribe and share this with someone who thinks nature is just a backdrop. But the program was far from safe, because between that 2012 milestone and the autonomous expansion, the satellite data would eventually reveal something was working against these birds from inside the landscape itself. And it gets worse before it gets extraordinary. The 2012 breeding was not a turning point. It was a warning that the population was still far too fragile to survive what was coming, because the same landscape that had poisoned these birds out of existence in 1912 had not finished with them. Between 2007 and 2019, according to records held by Ireland's National Parks and Wildlife Service, multiple white-tailed eagles were confirmed dead from illegal poisoning, carbofuran, a pesticide so toxic it was banned across the European Union in 2008, yet continued to appear in the Irish countryside in bait form for years afterward. These were not accidents. Carbofuran does not end up inside an eagle by chance. Someone put it there. And every bird it killed represented not just a death, but the erasure of a potential breeding lineage that the program had spent years building toward. Then came Storm Hannah in April 2019, which destroyed active nest sites during breeding season, nests that bonded pairs had spent months constructing, carrying sticks weighing kilograms across kilometers of coastline. Then avian influenza, a disease that does not discriminate between a common gull and Europe's largest bird of prey. 3 separate threats: poison, storm, disease. Each one capable of collapsing the population on its own. Together, they made one conclusion unavoidable: 100 birds was not enough. The NPWS launched Phase 2, introducing a further 145 eagles between 2020 and 2022 to push the population past the threshold where a single catastrophic event could unravel everything. Let that land for a second. After 18 years, the entire project could still have been erased by a bad storm and a contaminated carcass. But the biggest surprise was not the threats. It was what the surviving eagles started doing in places no one was watching. Here is where the data stops being a conservation story and becomes something harder to categorize. By 2024, satellite tracking records confirmed that white-tailed eagles had established a breeding territory in Northern Ireland, the first verified breeding pair in that region in 150 years. No bird had ever been released there, not one. The pair had navigated there autonomously, selected a site, built a nest, and bred. The program had not planned for this. No management protocol covered it. The eagles had simply decided that the boundary of the reintroduction zone was not their boundary. The tracking data showed something even more significant when viewed at the scale of the entire island. Eagles released in Killarney in the southwest had dispersed northward across the full length of the country, from Cork on the southern coast to Donegal on the northern Atlantic shore, nearly 500 kilometers. An apex predator had redrawn its own range across an entire nation in under 2 decades. And with that range came the function. Shorelines that had accumulated carrion for a century were being processed again. Waterbird populations in territories with established eagle pairs were showing behavioral changes, wariness, altered feeding patterns, population pressure that ecologists had not observed in living memory on the Irish coast. The eagles were not decorating the landscape, they were running it. Drop your thoughts on the Isla Mara in the comments. If this video showed you a side of the coast you've never seen, hit that like button and subscribe. And that is where the story gets truly interesting, Because what the eagles left behind is not just a changed ecosystem. It is a permanent one. Consider what the full arc of this story actually contains. Species hunted to administrative extinction in 1912. A century of coastline running broken without anyone realizing it was broken. A biological gamble launched in 2007 across 2 countries, 2 languages, and 2 phases of intervention. A population that survived poison, storm, and disease, and then, when it had survived all of that, stopped following the plan entirely. Nests in counties no program ever targeted. A breeding pair in Northern Ireland that no one released, choosing a territory no model predicted. An apex predator dispersed across 500 kilometers of a nation it had not touched in 100 years. And a coastal ecosystem, according to 18 years of peer-reviewed monitoring data, is beginning to process itself again for the first time since before the First World War. That is the shape of what you just watched. Not a success story, not a wildlife documentary, a documented case of biological function returning to a landscape that had quietly collapsed around its absence, and no one had measured the collapse because no one alive remembered what the landscape was supposed to sound like when it was whole. Here is what that means stated plainly. If a single returned species can reorganize the food web of an entire coastline in under 2 decades, then what we have been calling the natural world for the last century is not natural. It is the aftermath. It is what remains after systematic removal. The baseline we have been protecting, studying, and calling pristine is a biological desert that we inherited and mistook for normal. The question is no longer whether reintroduction works. The data settled that, in 2012, when a wild-born chick hatched exactly 1 century after the last confirmed breeding pair disappeared. The question is what we have the courage to bring back next. Duncan Halley, the senior research scientist at Norway's Institute for Nature Research, who oversaw the Norwegian contribution to this program across its full 18-year run, has described the project as a career highlight, not because it succeeded on paper, but because it exceeded every model his team had built. When someone with that credential and that tenure says a project exceeded every model, that is not enthusiasm. That is a scientist telling you the animal knew something the science did not. The NPWS declared the reintroduction officially complete in 2025. There are no more release phases planned, no further management interventions scheduled. The eagles are on their own, and they are, by every satellite record available, doing exactly what an apex predator does when you return it to a landscape that has been waiting for it, expanding, processing, reorganizing, and building nests so large and so permanent that pairs will return to them for decades. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next, because the next video covers what happens when you return a 30-pound rodent with nothing but mud and sticks to a dead river system, and what it does to that landscape makes everything in this video look like a warm-up. In 2007, Ireland loaded eagle chicks into transport crates. By 2025, those birds had redrawn the biology of an entire nation. The coast did not need managing, it needed its predator back.